Hey fellas, glad you could join me. I'm just having a little fishing trip here. How do you guys feel about fish of wealth? How about another one? I think I'm gonna make this my intro. One second, I gotta get my script. Hey fellas, in the midst of my skin ranking vids, I got another video for y'all. Still ranking video, don't worry, I haven't lost my place in my Paladins content creator corner. This time though, I'm gonna be ranking every ultimate, based on its effectiveness, use cases, that kind of thing. One bow. This is obviously just my thoughts on the matter. This is certainly not the end-all be-all when it comes to ultimate rankings. Hopefully it's pretty clear that this is obviously subjective and just for fun. This intro paints a pretty good picture of how seriously I'm taking this. I got it. Alright, let's get into it, but let me catch this shit first. Fish. Alrighty, I got a few things to mention real quick, but if you just want to get straight to the list, that's cool. I'll put a timestamp on screen now. I put every ultimate into titled categories to help myself rank them all, but I started realizing I was using those titles as vocabulary to describe the ult in the video itself. Even if they're kind of self-explanatory, I figured I'd go over them real quick just so we're all on the same page. Personal ultimates take up most of the list, as they are simply ultimates that buff or give some means of special effect and or damage to the ult user. You'll most often hear me talking about this in context of primary enhancing ultimates, which are just ults that buff a champion's primary greatly. Stalling ults are self-explanatory, healing ults are even more self-explanatory. Executes are ultimates that guarantee a single kill if a particular criterion is met. I use the word execute pretty liberally throughout the video despite the fact that not all ults I slap the label on are technically true executes, but you do get the idea. I'll specify when it's important. I got an airplane going by. Lovely. Global ultimates are ults that affect all allies and or all enemies on a mass scale in a huge bubble around the ult caster. Setup ultimates are a general term I use for ults that use crowd control to put enemies in a place of vulnerability, thus setting them up for some form of damage. And finally, payoff ultimates refer to ults with generally large-scale AoE attacks and large windups, aka ults that reach their fullest potential if paired with some form of setup, hence setup ultimates and payoff ultimates. Although I'm of course not specifically ranking ults in tandem with each other bar very general realizable potential. To kind of demonstrate every ult in action, I am going to be using plenty of footage from bot games, so just letting you know ahead of time if I suddenly look like I'm doing really good and the enemy looks really stupid. I'm not trying to mislead anyone, I just wanted to speed up getting some footage and show off ult potential without wasting too many hours on one ult trying to find the perfect way to showcase it in a real match. As usual, I've also asked Skillizzy to help me with the footage. Thank you, you're a dear. Keep in mind, no ultimate in this game is straight up bad. They're every character's most powerful ability in some regard, and I don't want anyone thinking I'm calling their character's ult garbage just because it's lower on the list. I'll be taking everything I feasibly can into consideration for each ultimate, including the character it's on, or if it's affected by a talent, but admittedly I'm not proficient in every single champion, and I only have so much time I can spend describing an ultimate and its placement in a video like this, but I'll do my best to cover everything important. There's only one aspect that I won't be taking into consideration about ultimates, but I'll cover that once we get to the first actual example. Okay, I'm done. Let's get into the meat and bones of this thing. Every ability is subject to change, but as of the Wild Horde update, or patch, or whatever it's called, this is my list. Take it away, past me. At the very bottom, there always has to be one, Atlas's Exile, starting with an ultimate that literally, or at least technically, does absolutely nothing. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the potential to do something cool with an ability that locks people out of doing literally anything at all is certainly there. But keep in mind, even the worst ultimates are hardly going to be bad. More often than not, the lower ones will simply be very niche, or niche if you want to be a nerd, with plenty of potential but lacking any consistent impactful strategy. This one I initially felt could be stronger just because it feels so out there. It was very intimidating to think of all the potential, but breaking it down, you can make up to 3 people stop in their tracks for 4 seconds each, or maybe make one person stop for 8 seconds if you wish, before they go right back to whatever they were doing beforehand. In an FPS, 4 seconds can be a lot, but the problem with this ultimate is it really doesn't do anything to actually deal with the enemy, unlike other ultimates. It doesn't kill, and it's not like there's a punishable section at the end of the banish. Whenever an enemy Atlas initiates the ultimate, I'm never avoiding it because I'm afraid of getting hit. I'm avoiding it because sitting there for 4 seconds doing nothing is boring as shit. This is ignoring the fact that those 4 seconds can actually help me get my bearings on the match during the small period of time in which case I am completely invulnerable. In other words, it can actually occasionally be kinda nice. There just isn't much to be afraid of, especially in modes where killing the enemy is the primary objective. The only consistent strategy I can think of is in a point fight, where the enemy is trying to get back on point so you can stall them in their tracks for just long enough to capture, but even then it has issues. It's so slow to pull out, meaning you can't use it quickly or on reaction. They must be used preemptively. The shooting state also ironically locks you out of any of your abilities, despite you being immune for any CC during its effects, which is always nice. Lastly, if an enemy is on point and they are banished, it doesn't actually take them off the point. Despite them being non-existent anymore, they are still apparently contesting the point, making a strength on point much weaker and even a little less intuitive. On top of all that, it's CC, meaning if it's really that annoying, resilience is a hard counter, with the banishment time being reduced to a minimum of 1 second, aka making the ult almost literally do nothing. Again, it has potential, but its extravagance mostly comes with its unique idea. In practice, it's a weak stall that's annoying to go up against and is outclassed by, in my opinion, every other ultimate in the game. Hazan's Deliverance. It's actually called that. Definitely less potential with this one compared to most ultimates, making up for it with some pretty consistent yet low damage for an ult, plus good control of where to direct that damage. The damage itself is a little unintuitive, with the hammer throw doing 750 damage and the body slam only doing 250. Gameplay wise it makes sense, it just kind of looks like it should do the opposite, which I think is funny. Another odd thing is that the first hit has a bit of knockback, potentially knocking enemies away from the second part of the ultimate. I don't think it does that consistently at all, but it certainly wouldn't be ideal. Aside from that, the 1000 damage in total that the ult can do, it's kind of just not that much. Both attacks are AoE in about the size of a point, kinda. I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell, but even so, compared to most of their ultimates, even less extravagant ones, the damage is on the lower side. But hey, at least it doesn't do 0 damage. The really cool stuff actually comes from the mobility this ultimate unlocks for Hazan. Of course, there's the obvious ways Hazan can maneuver over walls and stuff, but there's a few other really niche and cool tricks that need to be super well spaced to work and could be incredibly helpful in traversing the map quickly. What I'm showing off here are just a few I personally found, but there's definitely more out there. There are even some ways that I'm not going to show. I don't want to get them patched. They kind of break the map a little bit, and hey, I think that's pretty cool. Does that stuff make this all better? Nah, but I don't know, it sure makes it more fun to use. Sati's Wallbang. Sati's ultimate is really awkward to find use cases for, mostly because of just how slow it is. It has a cool wind-up animation which is too slow to react to anything with before putting you in this shooting state, similar to Atlas's, with each individual shot having about as much wind-up as, oh, I don't know, Caspian ult or Tyra ult. It's ridiculously slow for a lower damage ultimate. 777 damage is technically nothing to scoff at, but considering you'll be shooting behind walls or in general guessing where your target is, you're going to be missing a decent few. Getting closer to avoid missing wouldn't be very smart just because of how unsafe it is, plus in that case you could also just kind of shoot your gun normally and pump out equally consistent damage that way. You can't exactly use it defensively because of, again, how unsafe and slow it is. The only real opportune time would be if you're already in a safe place or if your team has the advantage, but even then, you still have to use it with caution. It's committal as hell. There's no point you can really use this ult securely. The saving grace for this ultimate is how fast it charges, but this is where I explain that I'm not taking ultimate charge rates into consideration for this list. I want to look at specifically how impactful each ultimate is when directly compared to each other in damage effects and the like. For instance, if every character could only use their ultimate once per match, how impactful would that ultimate be? That is already pretty tricky, like having to find a balance between consistency and potential makes my brain very confused. Throwing in ult charge rates just makes it so much more confusing in a way that I feel is almost impossible to rank. Not to mention the more logical reason of, in general, if an ultimate has a lower charge time, that would mean that the ult is inherently less impactful than others with longer charge times. But back to Sati, yes, cool plays can be made with Sati's ultimate mostly due to his AoE, but a lot of these plays are made with a mix of educated guesses, luck, and a whole lot of ult spam. A very fun ultimate, but more often than not, a single use of the ult will end up being a bit disappointing as you hit one bullet, miss the next, then accidentally hit a guy you weren't aiming for with the last. Potential is mid and inconsistent as all hell. Strix's Flashbang, just another pretty mid ultimate. The fact that it's an AoE and the fact that it can blind for up to 3 seconds, which is actually higher than any stun caused by ultimates, are the only reasons it's not lower. This ultimate can secure a kill or secure your escape fairly consistently until any sort of resilience comes online, in which case the ult straight up stops doing a whole lot. It also deals 250 damage, which is something. Even without resilience though, if you have good knowledge of the map and good spatial awareness, it's really not that hard to put yourself somewhere where you'll be safe until the blindness wears off. It's a very basic low cooldown ultimate that does what it's supposed to do until it doesn't.
Your sight fails you.
Shallin's Heat Haze. Obviously with every ultimate, the better you are at that specific character, the better you'll be at using their ultimate. But with Shallin, I feel like that's much more pronounced considering his ultimate is kind of just his normal gameplay. This ult is somewhat similar to Willow's ultimate, where instead of flying to make Shaw harder to deal with, he just goes invisible. Due to him being grounded, he is easier to track down than it might seem. Plus, unlike Willow, Shallin's stealth can always be hard countered by Illuminate. Okay, way to date my original recording. Illuminate no longer exists, of course, but in my opinion that doesn't change enough to make it actually higher. It's still easily exploitable. Shallin gets 30% movement speed, and his draw time is reduced by 50% during the ultimate's 8 seconds, but that's the end of it. It doesn't do anything inherently for you, it completely counts on you to get the job done, making it very inconsistent and rather hard to rank. Not to mention that if the enemy does happen to go full Illuminate, your ult basically amounts to movement speed and faster shots, take it or leave it. Appreciated buffs for sure, but it mostly amounts to the same gameplay that Shao would normally end up going for the entire match. I can't imagine it on average being very impactful, although potential is certainly present. Also, don't mind the gameplay, I don't play Shaolin, he makes my hands hurt. Willow's Fey Flight. Again, the potential for this one is large. You can fly for goodness sake. You don't have to reload for its duration, so in the right circumstances you can certainly rain some hell, but it's also pretty sluggish and enemy hit scan, even projectiles can take you out pretty easily. It depends on the map, depends on the enemy, but for the most part it ends up being inconsistent and generally easy to deal with. Plus at the end of the day, it's just Willow sitting up there, shooting her lower damage Willow bullets, plus her bombs and stuff, the danger of which again really varies on the circumstance. It does however give a nice speed boost at the beginning, making it a pretty consistent way to get out of danger if need be, plus CC immunity on command is always useful aside from the inconsistent opportunities that the ultimate already gives. Kasumi's Bitter Betrayal. Kasumi's ultimate ends up being one of the most safest to pump out, with minimal startup and the simplest auto-aim known to man, but is also one of the most basic damage ultimates with somehow one of the most convoluted ways of carrying that damage out. For those unaware, Wait, I already did this before, didn't I? Her ultimate just kind of turns you into Explosion, and an infectious one of that. It does buttloads of damage and shoots out these weird little dart things in a flat radius around the target. As usual, it slaps a bunch of those curse stacks on everyone, but the most annoying thing about it is how it's used. Okay, got it, thanks. The exact numbers are 1,520 damage over time for every enemy affected, that being the enemy the ult was initially placed on, as well as whoever might be hit with the little dart things. The curse stacks maxing out on whoever is hit is likely the most potentially impactful portion of the ultimate, allowing Kasumi to approach a little more aggressively, maybe finishing off whoever was already affected. It can be one of the only times Kasumi actually feels like a threat these days. Aside from that though, it's a pretty basic lower damage ultimate. It's got some potential at least, but it can be pretty underwhelming if the darts just don't end up hitting anyone, which, considering the source of the darts is literally determined by the enemy, is relatively common. Zin's Spite. This is the first ultimate with a talent that messes with the ult in some fashion. I will be taking talents into consideration as much as I validly can. Anywho, this ult on average is pretty decent at selectively taking out slightly damaged opponents quickly, or surviving otherwise ill-fated 1v1s, dealing 2,000 damage in a series of strikes dealing 400 damage each. Now, it is generally reactable, so missing it due to an opponent just juking you isn't totally uncommon, whether accidentally or not, so it isn't as consistent as it could be, which is why I figure it specializes in 1v1s, as it's much easier to tell if the opponent has already use their mobility at that point. The entire ultimate playing out also gives plenty of time for the enemy team to react and punish you for it, so it can hardly be used willy-nilly like that. I remember points where Zin was actually a big meta threat. I used to love when enemy Zins would ult. It legitimately felt like the only time you could consistently kill him without him using one of his like various stalling abilities and just running away. Another strange situational aspect about Zin's ult is that it's his only means of vertical movement. I can't say I play Zin much, so I'm not certain how applicable this is. It's no Azan movement, but I see it occur consistently enough to where it has to be somewhat valid, albeit at the same time, the fact that the ult's actual purpose is occasionally passed off in favor of it being used as a simple maneuverability ability does kinda say something about how potent this ult really is. Now, his talent Guillotine causes each individual hit to instead do 20% of the target's maximum health, effectively dealing 100% of the target's health overall. The fact that it can straight up turn into an execute is pretty insane, and I do see this talent run a decent amount these days. It's just certainly not the most reliable execute. Full health or even lower, almost any amount of healing can cause the ultimate to just not kill. Ideally you want to use this on a tank, but like I said, you can be killed in the middle of the ultimate's duration pretty easily, and since the tank is usually in the middle of the team, it's a bit harder than it might seem. Plus the rather humorous fact that if the user of the talent targets someone whose base health is below 2,000, it'll actually do less damage than the base ultimate, which I just think is funny. The entire ultimate doesn't really have much potential, and normally with that lack of potential, the ult would be balanced out with general consistency, but this ultimate struggles in that regard as well. Still pretty nuts in the right circumstance for a tank to suddenly be shredded in a generally low ultimate effort by a generally low effort ultimate, so it certainly isn't bad by any means. Vatu's Nightfall. Possibly the simplest ultimate in the entire game, a dash that deals 800 damage and stuns for 1.25 seconds. It can come out near instantly and will very consistently secure a kill on squishies. Although it's countered by resilience of course, even a small stun is always helpful, plus the safety makes it pretty much unpunishable to go for. It has the added bonus of being able to hit more than one opponent, but that's not really something Vatu can directly take advantage of, so its use is somewhat limited in that regard, albeit giving the ult a bit more potential. Basic ult with very basic counterplay, consistent but hardly impactful. Seven's Decree 77. In practice, this ends up being very similar to Vatu's ultimate, with the main boiled down differences being it takes a little longer to use, but can more effectively stun or rather fear multiple opponents. If you have a good view on the battlefield, you can actually fear the entire enemy team. Not that that would usually happen, but it certainly increases its potential. In more practical usage, you'll usually be aiming for like 1 or 2, and therefore securing a kill at least relatively consistently. It also does less damage than Vatu's at a mere 250 damage, but fears for longer than Vatu's stun at 2 seconds, which I feel is more impactful. It's a little unintuitive, sometimes I feel it should fear when it doesn't, but I assume that's just my inexperience with the ult talking instead of anything valid. But again, in practice it's a very basic ult with very basic counterplay, as it is of course affected just as harshly with resilience. Octavia's Creeping Barrage. Octavia's ultimate definitely seems less like an actual damage ultimate and more based on positioning and control of the map. Each individual beam starts with this small circle dealing 100 damage and immediately destroying all shields, which is followed up by the main beam dealing 850 damage. It's really nothing to scoff at, and due to the erratic nature of the beam's movement, it can be very distracting and jarring to stay out of the ultimate's wake. Seeing as Octavia can quickly move after setting out the ultimate, all this mental warfare is something she and her team can immediately take advantage of. However, this is likely the pinnacle of I'ma just throw throw it out and hope it hits someone. There's pretty much zero way to set up into it or predict anyone will run into it. It completely relies on the mental warfare I mentioned in order to cause someone to get hit due to confusion or be killed while distracted by the ult, or that someone will just walk into it unaware, causing the ultimate to be very unreliable and actually spewing out damage. The talent display of force doesn't change much in terms of the actual ult. It's still just as reactable, but makes the mental warfare more extreme. It goes from, I kinda don't want to be hit by that to, okay, wow, I really don't want to get hit by that. The initial beam now roots, ensuring the main beam will hit, and the main beam gets buffed from 850 damage to 1450 damage. It makes any stray hit certainly count more, but I mean, since everyone's generally staying away from the giant fucking damage beams anyway, it really doesn't change anything in terms of strategy, and still remains mostly the same, extremely inconsistent with super varying potential. Terminus is Reanimate, the only instance of a straight revive in the entire game alongside a shitty sky bomb. The bomb portion certainly makes space for the revive, but in terms of actual usage, everyone knows the explosion is coming before it's even popped. Like, it's so utterly obvious even before the countdown begins, and it's not like you'd ever be able to set up anything into it since, you know, you have to die to initiate it. On top of that, it only does 2,600 damage, more than enough to take out most squishies, but for reference, Skies does 3,000. And yeah, diminishing returns the higher the damage goes past squishy killing range, but still, most tanks are just fine with tanking it if they don't feel like just, you know, hiding behind the damn payload. The revive itself is obviously the most consistent part about the ult. You could even think of it as like a negative execute if you want to be weird about it. It saves you no matter what. Mind the Atlas on the other team. But keep in mind the character you're reviving is still just Terminus. It's not like you can choose who you're going to save, like a Ray ult or even a Ying ult that just heals everybody. A revive is clearly really good, like don't get me wrong, but Terminus just isn't the best character to take advantage of it for a lot of the time. After the ultimate is used, the Terminus often has to be very defensive considering the giant fucking bomb indication that just told everyone you are going to be very vulnerable in approximately 2.5 seconds. This can often result in a reckless ult being punished by the Terminus immediately being melted on the spot. Quite a few negatives are involved, but it will consistently bring a tank back to life, and allows Terminus to be more aggressive when the ult is online. So very obviously it can be useful and even crucial during point fights, pushes, and whatnot. Defensively less so, but I guess it has its uses there too, I suppose. Tiberius's Blade Dance. Definitely one of the more fun ultimates in the game. It kinda just allows you to run amok and do some damage as long as you're not getting beat down too hard in the meantime. The variants of this ult can be pretty nuts, and the two moves you're granted are decently suited for general situations. The first is a simple dash dealing 650 damage to whomever you come in contact with, and the second is a slower, damage immune spinny attack that's easier to react to but deals 900 damage in a large radius. Tiberius can use either of those abilities communally 5 times before the ultimate ends. It's really surprisingly hard to punish this ultimate while he's just dashing around and being damage immune, so it does allow him to kind of go ham for a little bit. It's also just super mobile in general, which isn't something Tiberius is normally known for, so somewhat similar to Zin's ult, it can be used to get to various places where he really normally wouldn't be able to get to, while not using the whole ult in the process, unlike Zin. That being said, it's also easy to see coming, as each ability usage has adequate windows to punish, and the higher damage spinny move is somewhat simple to avoid. Running amok is the best way I can think to describe the usage of this ult, and it can be used defensively to get a kill and run, or just run in general, despite some startup. It has a lot of mid-bar potential, and consistently gets a chunk of damage out of the mix. Nothing too intense, but allowing you to adapt your usage of the abilities on the fly makes its possible variance and use cases pretty crazy. Grover's Whirlwind. I struggled a lot on where to rank healing ultimates, and as a result, I'm relying a lot on Skillizzy's advice when ranking them, since she's a bit more of a healer than I am. The largest issue with healing ultimates in general is they are countered so easily by the insidious mechanic for healers that is anti-heal. Still likely a controversial mechanic, I'm fine with it, but for ultimates that completely rely on healing, let's just say you're pretty much rendered inert. The mass heal of 2,500 per second drops to a mere 250 health per second at the lowest, almost negligible for a tank or whoever else might be being pelted in the middle of a match. Obviously that's at max anti-heal, but you get the point. Most damage or flanks can easily match or outdo the healing with their damage alone at differing points throughout the anti-heal growth. And you know, good luck healing a tank or a grouped up team, they're always out there getting shot. As anti-heal grows rather quickly, this massive AoE heal ends up having to be used quite sparingly and selectively, rather than the clutch team healing monster of an ult it could be at the beginning of a match, which it definitely can be. It just becomes countered so quickly by what's now an actual base game mechanic. It's a crazy ult until it's not. Can be cancelled early though, which is kind of cool. Saves you some ult charge and makes it feel more like a strong ability on a large cooldown, which is good for how selective you end up having to be with it. Also, look at how this shit used to work. This shit was goofy.
This realm will be consumed.
Yaggaroth's Devour is the first true execute on this list. Basic as it can be, no health requirement, just latch onto someone and wait for a sec for the ultimate. It's intentionally designed to be somewhat like a boss fight, and as such, activating the ultimate also activates a special 3750 health pool for Yaggaroth, separate from her actual HP. If that special health pool is drained fast enough, the ultimate is effectively wasted on the Yaggaroth's end, and there's even a large period of vulnerability that Yaggaroth goes into. This makes her ult actually potentially dangerous to go for, as a careless ult by Yaggo can easily result in the death of a front line, putting the whole damn team in jeopardy. It can also be used to stall for a short time if you're low health, but that's about it in terms of subtleties. It's a pretty basic ult that guarantees a kill a large portion of the time, which is always good, especially when used on a front line, but if messed up has a much bigger cost than most ultimates in the entire game, especially for an ult with the lower potential of just getting a single kill. Vora's Harbinger's Wrath is in a similar boat to Yaggaroth. Both are true executes, however you have to put in a little more work with Vora's, but as a counterbalance it's quite a bit safer to use overall as an execute. It used to be actually really solid as an escape option to the point where the execute property was legitimately secondary to its defensive use. I believe it used to have like 70 or 80% immediate damage reduction, as well as the 60% speed buff for the duration allowed it to get her pretty much out of any bad situation, and as Vora is a very defensive character, it was extremely useful. These days though, the DR only sits at 40%, making it as a defensive maneuver still viable to an extent, but you know, just a lot less. But yeah, pretty simple aside from that. Will guarantee one kill on a tank or otherwise if they are below 66% health, and if they are above that threshold, the ult will instead only do 1100 damage in a much faster animation, giving the enemy team less time to react, despite the fact that the entire ultimate is extremely reactable, which is its biggest downside compared to most other executes, and even ultimates in general. So yeah, a single kill pretty consistently, or at the very least a bit of damage. Not a ton of potential these days, but consistent and effective enough to be moderately impactful.
Good night.
Maeve's Midnight. So we got our first global ultimate here. Such a different concept, only really comparable to something like Strix's, I guess, so admittedly its placement is a bit more arbitrary. All the global ultimates are really. Maeve's ult has a ton of potential, a straight up unique blinding status effect, not incapacitating people, but certainly causing a lot of confusion for the ultimate's short duration of 4 seconds. A terrifying ult that demands attention and a bit of in the moment thinking. I think the main issue compared to other global ultimates is that there is hardly any time to push the advantage the ult gives. Like, most tanks can stall for 4 seconds, most damage or flanks can and or are in the position to hide for 4 seconds, and supports can often do both, sometimes simultaneously. There isn't anything terrible about this ultimate, its advantages are pretty obvious, it just doesn't last that long, and it has the most ways to counter it as opposed to other global ultimates, maybe even ults in general. There's always the classic Cassie ult counter which straight up nullifies Maeve's, but there's the more prominent fact that Maeve's ult is technically CC, meaning you can just get resilience to reduce the ult's duration even more. Maeve dying also stops the ultimate entirely, which isn't super uncommon. Then there's just the fact that the enemy can just kind of ignore it and keep doing whatever they're doing. Like, if they're a tank, they'll keep tanking. If they're damaged, they'll keep spamming around a corner. Healers will still heal, and so on. You and your team gotta work quick in order to take advantage of the debilitation, rather than the debilitation doing much of anything specifically. And it's certainly easy enough to do so, but it also does inherently make it less consistent. Not bad by any means. It's pretty normal for this ult to net at least a kill alongside aiding general control of the map and whatnot. Very hard to measure, but this is around where I place it.
You can't resist me.
Nyx's Chaos Nexus, whatever the f that means. Another first, this time in the mass CC category. Most of these kind of ultimates are very powerful, with the main drawback being they can be easily countered by resilience, but Nyx's ult has a lot of its own issues alongside the usual. Mainly it's very easy to escape the ultimate during its 2 initial 100 damage stomps, before the final 600 damage and stunning stomp actually comes out, making it inconsistent at best for dealing with multiple enemies. Most squishies can escape the first 2 stomps rather easily, and if used in a group, normally the tank ends up being the only one actually stunned. A tank who is generally much more willing to, well, tank it. Admittedly, this ultimate is a bit newer, so naturally I have less experience with it or dealing with it, but it can certainly still be quite useful. It can finish off folks who are caught off guard or trying to escape, having already used their mobility. At least that's pretty consistent. Doing it in the middle of an enemy group can certainly succeed as well. It's mainly just very inconsistent in that area. It's not really something calculatable, it's just more something you throw out in a crowd and see if it works. Although something that does bump this up alone is something actually Nyx specific. Her ultimate causes any damage over time she might be taking due to her wacky Royal Presence ability to be completely cured back into normal health, obviously helping her survivability and giving the ultimate some much needed utility. Brings a bit of consistency into the mix, making the 2-second stun almost feel like a straight up bonus, although that aspect obviously has plenty of its moments as well, just not super reliably. In short, don't solo ult a flank, it won't work.
Last one standing wins!
Barracks Fortify. Oddly, this is the only ultimate involving shields in the entire game. Nearly immediate immense protection with a dome-shaped 10,000 health shield. Good for defense obviously, great for helping to outlast the enemy team, gives a nice place for teammates to be safe. The benefits are obvious. It just doesn't last very long at 6 seconds. It's decent, but folks have been asking for potential ways to make this ultimate more potent for like 6 years now, and it's remained practically the same aside from the talent, which I'll touch on in a sec. There's a turret inside the dome to prevent non-friendly folks from coming inside, aka a flamethrower that does 600 damage a second, but I can't honestly say it does its job all that well. I have a habit of just walking into the dome and killing Barrack, which I'd call a bad habit if it weren't for the fact that 90% of the time it just kind of works. Regardless, it is a solid defensive ult. I'd be lying if I said it isn't very consistently a dome. Alongside all that, if you want to say screw you to defense, Barrack's talent Forge Fire removes the shield completely and lessens the ultimate's cost to only 40% of the ultimate's regular cost. This means you only end up placing down the flamethrower. Meanwhile, its 6-second uptime is increased to, well, indefinite, or until destroyed, of course. Oddly, the flamethrower is mostly a nerfed version of the non-talent version, dealing only 320 DPS, and lowering its HP and range. I don't have the confidence to say if this talent makes the ult better or worse. Trading the immediate defense of Barrack's default ultimate seems pretty rough comparatively though. I can't imagine it's better, or at least without dual tanking or something. I don't know. Regardless, it's variants and another possible strategy for Barrack's ult in general, which will always make its case just a little more solid. Io's Be Gone. This is a really awkward ultimate, since for the most part it's really just a downgraded version of Torvald's ultimate. It's smaller, less active, and does less damage at 800. It comes out slower, making it straight up reactable if you're fast enough. I feel like these quote-unquote nerfs relative to Torvald could be good counterbalance if Io's wasn't affected by resilience or something. It kind of feels like it shouldn't be. Like it feels like you're just kind of being dragged away rather than being pushed or stunned like a normal CC. But just like Torvald's ult, it's heavily affected by resilience. The only clear difference and upgrade when compared to Torvald is that Io's ultimate causes her to be damage immune and CC immune immediately on activation, which has many uses on its own for sure. Aside from that, it sure does push people. I mean, I say that with a bit of droll, but it certainly has its potential. It's good for getting people away from points, I suppose. It's often used defensively as a means for Isle to protect herself, from what I understand, but also just kind of seems underwhelming in those areas for me personally. The main cheese, of course, is ulting people right off the entire map, but that's obviously map specific, making those opportunities strictly inconsistent. And to top it all off, the ult itself is sent out at a really awkward angle, and the hitbox is quite annoyingly wide, often clipping onto things you wouldn't want it to, effectively making the ult end early even for IO veterans. Just a slight bit unintuitive in an actual like kind of important sense. I'm being pretty negative about this ultimate, but actually being able to change the position of the enemy is inherently extremely powerful. The potential is still huge, but just not in the most obvious of ways, like straight damage and whatnot. Oh yeah, and you can do this weird thing, which is kind of cool, I guess. Talus's true power. Quite similar to an execute in some ways, trading the consistency of the kill for the ability to target, well, anyone anywhere. The ult itself does 600 damage, not including Talus doing his Talus things after the teleport obviously. It is quite reactable and very possible to read the room and tell who Talus will teleport to, and thus the enemy team can retreat to help, or they might already be there to defend. It's kind of hard to tell as the Talus sometimes. Then again, Talus is Talus, and I imagine most botched or careless ults will simply result in the Talus teleporting away again without much chance to punish him, which does make it safer than it might seem just because it's attached to Talus himself. The ultimate is clearly powerful, as you can essentially choose who you want to fight alongside a small advantage, but you do have to do most of the work yourself, as the ultimate will only ever do 600 damage to a single enemy, and never anything more. Semi-consistent, the harder the target is for Talus specifically to deal with, the lower the consistency, and to top it off, its potential is severely limited.
Hey bro, watch your jet. Watch your jet, bro. Watch your jet!
Sky's Bomb. Time Bomb to be specific, as if most bombs in this game aren't timed in one way or another. I want to say this is probably the most infamous ult in the entire game, you know, the new player killer or whatever, but for sure this is the most overt example of mass damage with zero utility. It does 3000 damage in a huge radius after a 2.5 second fuse, though the timer and the giant indication that the bomb's about to go off gives plenty of time for the enemy team to react, finish up their 1v1, choose their beam of choice, then select their hiding. A wall, a pillar, a rock, a shrub, or you know, the damn payload. It's still totally possible to get kills with this thing, like obviously if folks are caught off guard, mess up hiding, or are busy on a point fight, stuff like that. It just takes some general quick thinking and map knowledge to put the bomb somewhere awkward enough to end up actually getting a kill or two. Something cool about it though, I don't think this is the same with most other similar ultimates, but aside from general geometry, Sky's ult goes through like just about everything. It destroys shields, it goes through reversals, that kind of thing. Apparently though not Zen counter. It's also the first really big payoff ultimate, like if you're in a voice chat with a Ceres or a Maldamba or something, this is one of the better ultimates that can combo super effectively. It's not going to happen much, but the fact that it has kinda crazy realizable potential, as opposed to just the general statement of, oh, it has potential, totally, probably, is certainly a step up. Betty the Bomba's Long Live the Queen, a flying sky alt with a weirder explosion hitbox and way less damage. I'm gonna be using sky alt as an adjective to describe big explosion payoff ultimates a lot, so be prepared for that, I guess. These moving explosion ultimates, when compared to the stationary explosion ultimates like Sky's, have a weird combo of being more obvious that it's coming, while also being less obvious of where the explosion is actually gonna end up. This ultimate is technically less predictable, while being even more reactable, which I think is better. Maybe. It also does less damage than Sky Alt by a little over 1,000, specifically dealing 1,900 damage in a very strange radius that sometimes feels like it just doesn't even hit anyone. It's really weird. Then again, this is a newish character, and it does seem like folks are kind of figuring out how to hit it more consistently these days. I feel it does more consistent damage than Sky's because of how manageable the explosion placement is, even if it's a bit sluggish, as if she lingers in the aerial portion of the ult, she can be taken out pretty easily. I also feel like there's probably tech with this ultimate that I don't know about yet, but oh well. Leon's Enlightenment. Probably like the second most basic ultimate you could ask for. A 1 second wind up with 50% damage reduction before blasting a large piercing projectile of 1,600 damage. It's quite safe, perfect for cheating 1v1s. It's fast enough to be used on reaction and therefore alongside setups like stuns and whatnot, perfect for finishing off enemies in general, and although it's just slow enough to be reactable, its optimal usage is after the opposing player expends their mobility already, which, like said, the ult is perfect for taking advantage of. Doesn't do the most damage in the world, but a very consistent 1,600 damage is better than any widely inconsistent 3,000 damage. Plus, it's piercing of course, causing its use against grouped up teams to not only be pretty safe, but normally quite effective. Consistent damage and consistent kills. The only subtle mechanic is on kill, 50% ult charge is refunded. Unfortunately, that's not per kill anymore. You used to be able to get the whole ult back immediately on a double kill, which I always thought was pretty sick, but nah. Nowadays, it's only if you get a kill rather than per kill. Also, I know I said I'm not counting ult charge rate into consideration, but this is more of a function rather than straight up ult charge rate. I don't know if that validates it, but don't worry, it's not like I'm boosting it up a ton due to that fact. It's just a bonus. Bucks Buck Wild. Hey, remember when this ultimate used to be like shit? It's gone through a ton of changes over time, but back in the day, it lasted 10 seconds, and for the duration, your cooldowns were reduced by 50%, and you took 30% less damage. That was it. That was the ult. On September of 2016, it was changed to only dealing double damage for 6 seconds alongside refilling ammo and resetting cooldowns, but keep in mind that this was when Buck did way less damage than he does now, varying depending on patch, but around 550. That was how I mostly remember his old ultimate, but it got reworked again in 2017, essentially putting the attributes of his old talent, elegantly titled Bucking Madness, onto his default ultimate, creating the ultimate we know today. After a bit of research, I can confirm I am misremembering this point specifically, but I refuse to specify how. Go we ball. Making this list just reminded me of all that old stuff, so I hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane, I suppose. Anyway, his modern ultimate grants him 60% increased attack speed and infinite ammo for the 6-second duration. This is the first quote-unquote primary ability enhancing ultimate we're covering on this list. The potential of these kinds of ults are always pretty insane, as you can react to any immediate situation quickly with a ton of damage as long as you can hit your shots and perform decently well. However, not only does this have the highest startup compared to any of the other primary enhancing ultimates, it also does the least theoretical damage. Realistically, this is never going to happen, but theoretically, if you hit every single shot, the maximum damage this ultimate can output is 6,720, which is a lot I suppose, but it will be dwarfed as we move up the list. This ult is of course dangerous in the right hands and situation, but I also can't help but feel very little fear of it in a match, not only because of the lower damage, but the range Buck needs to be to take advantage of it is much less lenient than other ultimates of the same type, and therefore much easier to avoid. Don't take this as me saying it's bad, it's really good. The potential is high, but the consistency is based on the player, and compared to some ults that are coming, I couldn't find a way to justify putting it higher. It's mostly just a worse version of a few ultimates that are to come. Rom's Cataclysm. In a weird way, I think of this ult in a similar manner to Leon's. It has some mid startup, can hit multiple enemies in front of them. However, Rom's does a bit less damage at 999 and has much less range to accommodate a wider spread. And lastly, it stuns. Though notably, it is the shortest stun out of any ultimate at 1.2 seconds, just behind Vatu's stun at 1.25 seconds, which annoys me. Why not just make it both 1.2? Fucking hell. In any case though, despite its weakness to resilience, I consider stuns to be considerably more powerful than straight damage. It's a very non-committal ultimate, very fast, gets the job done, great for most situations out there, but of course doesn't make as much of an impact in those situations as more specialized ultimates. Despite the stun, it can't exactly set up into a lot like other stunning ultimates, partially due to the stun time being lower, but also just because it's not as consistent to hit as other CC ultimates like Saris's or Inara's and whatnot. Especially considering its range, folks gotta be decently close comparatively, making it seem like more of a better Nyx ult actually. An AoE stun is absolutely never bad though, and it can actually be a bit harder to avoid than it might seem at first. Not to mention the hitbox goes vertically a decent amount as well, so it's not like you can just jump over it unless you got mad hops like Drogo's. Rom also has a talent called Earth Splitter that buffs the only thing I'm not taking into consideration, increasing its ult charge rate by 60%. So yeah, I'm not taking that into consideration, but just figured I'd mention it. Lex's The Law. Memes. I normally wouldn't assume I would put this kind of ult this high up. Like, you need to already do a decent amount of work to get someone down to the health range where the ult's actually available, and considering Lex has some pretty rapid and high damage, it's often not even worth using the ult in a 1v1 like other executes. But the fact that he can potentially execute multiple enemies at a time is terribly scary. And I'm not saying the oh potentially in a vague way. It actually seems to happen a decent amount from what I've seen. Doubles are pretty common, even triples aren't out of the picture with a pop of the E button. I'm not saying it's super consistent, but it's relatively feasible. Having this ultimate used on you during a point fight where everyone's at varying points of mid to low health is legitimately scary, even if the Lex is only going for the tank or something. It's entirely possible to get 1 or 2 picks from others who just happen to be low. It's pretty fast for an ultimate, it can be used on reaction, and therefore can be quite difficult to avoid as well. Specifically, it executes enemies at below 65%, which, by the way, Vor's ult executes at 66%. Again, that annoys me. But if hitting an enemy above that threshold, it simply does 600 damage. Nothing crazy, but that does mean at least you're getting some recompense for a wasted ult, which not a ton of ults do. The ultimate also resets the cooldown of Pursuit. Okay, now he doesn't gain any DR with his ult, so if you're quick, it's pretty easy to shut down. Due to how much health bars fluctuate, you're undoubtedly gonna accidentally waste a lot of ults. But the fact that it could potentially murder the entire enemy team, not the most feasibly, but like, what is feasible with this ult if the stars align, I often find quite surprising and very scary. And even then, in my experience, it tends to be a little more consistent than you might even think. Lilith's Blood Moon. Metal ass name. Reminds me of something else though. I'll be perfectly real, she's been out for a while and I still don't fully understand the perfect use for this ultimate. I asked for a lot of help when ranking it and this is where it ended up placing. From what I understand now, it has some good uses defensively, but also seems to be much more beneficial for Lilith herself, despite being another global ult. The global aspect of this ultimate gives all teammates 35% uncauterizable lifesteal, which is a good effect, don't get me wrong. It's just awkward to find a place in the match where you're like, yes, I want 35% lifesteal for 8 seconds in this exact moment. In a general sense, lifesteal itself has the potential to make you more tanky as long as you can perform well. It's a weird effect that has more passive and general use rather than situational, I suppose. Or at least the 8-second kind of situational, that is. The myriad of buffs that Lilith gains is much more applicable to general situations though. Alongside buffs to her general movement, she is healed for 475 blood per second because she runs on blood. Subtle. This, although not healing her immediately, can save her in a pinch and causes her to be extremely tanky, pumping out tons of her blood-dependent abilities. In other words, it makes your healer a beefy gal. And considering healers are often the most vulnerable, and the death of one could change the course of the match more so than likely any other role, this is pretty damn good. The ult consistently helps the healer, meanwhile the rest of its effects help less consistently but aren't bad by any means. An awkward but still really good ultimate. A tiny portion at the beginning also slows you by 50% and apparently gives you 50% DR, but like, is that even useful? It only lasts for a second. I wouldn't even know if the DR was there if I didn't read it on the wiki. Anyway. Vivian's Sentinels. Well, this is a really weird ultimate to rank as well. This is the only ultimate that could potentially like last the entire match, or you could lose it frame 1, so like, I don't know. The ult brings up these little turrets that accompany any shooting of the primary, dealing 150 in an AoE projectile with plenty of fall off every 1 second each. To put it simply, that's an extra 300 damage a second with both turrets up alongside Vivian's usual spammage. This can add up over time to theoretically do more damage than any other ultimate in the entire game could do, or you could do 0. The enemy can also kill the turrets individually. Does that change much? Like, why would you? Why not just kill Vivian instead? I guess it just means they're vulnerable to like collateral AoE, I guess, so they could still be killed if the Vivian just doesn't die. Realistically though, even if this ult can end up doing loads of damage over the course of the match, I can't imagine this ult would ever be that impactful. Nothing about it is going to sway the game state immediately. It's not like it's going to save a point or anything like that anytime soon. And really nobody's that afraid of it either. If it pops, it's not like anyone's running away. If anything, you're going to be targeted. It's pretty consistent damage though, whether it ends up being low or high damage at the end of a match. At least it's extra damage with 0 downsides. The potential is certainly there, it just lacks any general sway on the match that the Vivian player themselves can't provide with their regular gameplay. In other words, if you're getting stomped, this ult isn't going to do jack shit. It's great for the long haul, but it's never going to cause any great large impact, which ults are generally supposed to do. Grok's Tempest. This ultimate is pretty brutal, like it's a smorgasbord of just random effects and CC and damage and heals that pretty much nobody has any control over, not even Grok. To break down the madness, every half second the ultimate is active, Grok zaps up to 3 enemies and 3 allies nearby, with each enemy zap slowing and dealing 200 damage. Meanwhile, the zaps on allies heal for 350 health and increase their movement speed by 50%. Both the speed buffs and nerfs only last for 2 seconds unless reactivated by another of said zaps. In short, it slows and can deal up to 2,400 damage to each individual enemy hit, and to allies it increases speed while healing up to 4,200 health each. This all takes place over 6 chaotic seconds. The only real downside to this ult is just how uncontrollable it is. It tends to work out in the long run, but compared to other ultimates, this is absolute chaos. And I didn't even talk about how weird it is to control his, like, self. And that's kind of the other thing. To take full advantage of the ult, you'd want to do it in front of both your team and the enemy team, making you very vulnerable for the duration. Though the ultimate does self-heal at the same rate as your allies, which makes it a bit more survivable alongside the fact that the ult is cancelable if needed. Lastly, he is CC immune throughout the entire duration, which is always helpful alongside the laundry list of utility. Really not an ult you want to use solo that often. You do need a team to take full advantage of it, not to mention some enemies to hit, of course, which ironically makes the ult a bit more dangerous to use, but you know, that's just kind of the risk of ultimates like this. This one's pretty forgiving all things considered. Its damage and healing are consistent in a weirdly non-consistent way. The potential is also there plenty, but not as high as other ultimates, even some further below this one. It's pretty good, very middle of the road when it comes to ultimates. Dredge's Kraken. We've covered a few, you know, large damage in large area ultimates already. The thing that sets Dredge's apart is just how damn safe it is. In most of these kinds of ultimates, like Skies, Bettys, Bomb Kings, and whatnot, you have to be at least somewhat in the fight in order to actually use them. A little bit of risk reward per se. Dredge's legitimately seems to have zero risk to balance out the potential huge reward. The ult is simply produced where he's looking, making it completely safe to use while he's sitting in the back already blasting his random bouncing death balls, because God knows we won't want to interrupt that. Fucking hell, I hate this character. The trade-off is that the damage radius of the ult is relatively small. It'll cover a point, but considering the 1.4 second fuse, I don't know why it's not just 1.5, but yeah. The consistency of this ult in terms of kills is quite lacking. It has the consistency of a Sky ult, I'd say, being faster and more concentrated, with almost true safety most ults can only dream of. At the same time though, the safety that the ultimate gives does make this ultimate a little bit weird to place down, and by that I mean, it's not exactly the most precise thing in the world, let's put it at that. Like said, the only indication of where it's gonna be is your reticle. That's it. The range on this thing is fucking busted though. Regardless, it does 2,500 damage, and how it can be used on reaction, not to mention the fuse being relatively short, makes it much easier to use against cornered opponents running dry of all their resources. Not to mention, you know, Dredge gameplay, he's sitting in the back like a bitch the whole time, giving him often a lovely view of where exactly to put his wacky death ball. As usual with these kinds of ultimates, consistency isn't phenomenal, but decent enough. Meanwhile, its potential is absolutely present.
You're already dead.
Koga's Cyclone Strike. I consider this to be pretty similar to the AoE explosion ults we've already talked about a few times, with the only real difference conceptually being the damage in the radius is taken over time. The damage has a 1.1 second activation time, does 3,000 damage over 2 seconds occurring directly over top of Koga and causing him to be immediately intangible on activation. This makes the ultimate absolutely ideal to be used on reaction, clutching 1v1s and reacting to vulnerable enemies in the backline or even on point. It's useful in most scenarios, it just needs to be used at a time where the enemy isn't likely to escape, which is made a little bit easier by the damage radius being slightly movable while active. The trade-off for being incredibly safe on startup is a half second of vulnerability at the very end of the ultimate, so perhaps if you aren't quite able to finish off your target, you're likely to take a decent amount of punishment. What pushes the ult a little further up the list is Koga's talent. Blood Reaper removes the 1,500 damage per second, replacing it with dealing 125% the maximum health of whoever's affected over the entire duration, and increasing the damage radius's movement speed by 25%. This causes the ult to not only be able to deal with tanks more consistently and therefore be much more capable on point, but the speed increase also allows you to actually catch up to enemies who might be using their movement abilities to escape, making it almost inescapable for some champions straight up. Now, these kind of percentage maximum health talents do have the odd effect of causing the ult to deal less damage to characters with lower health pools. For instance, Cassie has a pretty average 2,200 health pool, and thus the 125% maximum health Koga's modified ult would output on Cassie would amount to 2,750 damage in total, aka less than the 3,000 damage Koga's default ultimate would do. At the same time though, being able to deal upwards of 5,000 damage or more on tanks and whatnot does easily make up for it, alongside the more consistent kills that come with the extra speed boost. And remember, this is only an extra option that the talent can give if it's chosen, and really extra options can only ever be positive. Anyway, Koga's ultimate in general is quite consistent if used on reaction properly, and his potential is pretty damn insane, especially with the extra option of the Blood Reaver talent. Victor's Barrage. Although not nearly as safe as Dredge's, this ult's maneuverability pushes it up just a little bit more. You become 40% slower during its use, meaning you might as well be as killable as an unprotected Amani during her ult, albeit Victor's ult is cancelable, which certainly helps. The damage is spread out between the 3 shells, each doing 1,400 damage. This gives it a lot more potential with like fake outs and shit. Like you could use the first shell to bait a movement ability from whoever you're targeting, making the second and even perhaps the third almost guaranteed to hit on most champions. It has the same inherent benefits of a usual high damage AoE ult alongside that fake out potential. It can be used on grouped up enemies to great effect, it can be used on an enemy who's already out of resources and in a bad spot, and just like like dredges, it has insane range, making distance pretty much a non-issue. Due to its extra fake out potential and whatnot, it is much slower to pull up than most other alts in this vein. You gotta bring up his whole targeting system first, and you're put in a similar state to like Sati's or Atlas's ult. As long as the ult is active, you are actively vulnerable as well. With the more spammy you use the ultimate, the safer you are, making it tempting to not even bother going for the extra options that the unique separated damage give. Not to mention that it is quite reactable, and given its line of sight nature, most champions are able to dodge out of line of sight if they know where Victor is, or even just aggress and kill him if he's that vulnerable. Regardless, this ult gives more options than the usual payoff large damage ultimates, while dealing up to 4,200 AoE damage, more than any ultimates covered so far. Well, as long as you don't count the potential damage of executes and whatnot. Torvald's Hyper Beam. The big pushy, pretty basic all things considered. It's huge, very active, does up to 1,410 damage, can be used on reaction and is unreactable, and it is heavily countered by resilience. The effect is basic, but its usefulness certainly varies. The huge and kind of cheesy plays that you can get by ulting people off the map is, just like Io's ult, incredibly map dependent, although much easier than Io's when the time comes. The fact that it could potentially and even realistically team wipe though, or at least get a few decent kills with the cheese pretty consistently if the Torvald is smart, especially with how fast the ult comes out, does make it very scary in the right circumstance, and something you almost need to anticipate if your team is in a potentially vulnerable spot for the ult. Aside from that, like I said with Io's ult, moving the enemy around is again inherently very powerful, both for defensive and stalling reasons, aside from the offensive stuff I just mentioned. It's pretty chaotic movement, but at least it's, you know, away, out of your hair for some odd seconds. It could be worse, I think. I'm also often surprised by just how much damage it does too. Like, the damage itself isn't solo killing tanks anytime soon, but is often enough to like kill a half health squishy if all hits connect. Due to the inconsistent and erratic nature of this ult, it's quite hard to rank, but its realizable potential for team wipes is present enough alongside the niche to even ever present potential that so much CC applies, does definitely make it something you have to consistently worry about. Even on maps with less or harder to access ledges, its potential still exists outside of areas such as the Big Cheese. On those fronts at least, it's pretty reliable, albeit nothing insane comparatively. Makoa's Ancient Rage. Memes 2. The Challenging. Kinda similar to Terminus's ult, this ult saves the tank from death, allowing stalling potential alongside the chance to behave more aggressively. When cast, the ult essentially completely heals Makoa in addition to a 4,000 health increase, giving him at base a total of 8,500 health to play with for 8 seconds. He retains access to all his cooldowns for the duration, however his primary ability is replaced with a melee anchor swing, dealing 550 damage every 0.8 seconds, as opposed to the 575 damage every second with his normal cannon. To put it more simply, the byproduct of the ult gives him higher DPS as a trade-off for it being a melee attack. Being an AoE, it has its advantages, but also, you know, its disadvantages. But this ultimate is also freely cancelable, so if the enemy has retreated and you feel the initial burst of health served its purpose, it can be cancelled early, and thus you once again have access to your very scary, ranged balls of string, enemies beware. All things considered, a pretty simple ultimate, very effective at saving yourself, and can easily get a kill. Although kills are obviously not the focal point, it's dangerous enough to be respected, and really that's all it needs. It's not going to be 1v5ing anytime soon, but it's more than capable of turning around a point fight even if you're down an ally or two. The talent Leviathan changes a few things about Makoa at base that I won't be talking about, but the actual changes to the ult itself are as follows. Increase movement speed by 20% for Ancient Rage's duration, and Ancient Rage's activation resets the cooldown of Makoa's secondary, aka his anchor, as well as his movement ability, aka his shell spin. Just makes it a tiny bit more threatening. It really doesn't change much in terms of the ult itself, and I hardly see people use this talent anyway, but options are options. Overall, a great defensive ultimate with a decent amount of potential, doesn't focus on killing, but saves an important team player. Drogos' Dragon Punch. The truest and most well-known execute that isn't even a true execute. An extremely reactable flying charge that deals 100% of enemy health on hit. The fun thing about this ult is, even if you're bad at it, like 8 times out of 10 you're gonna get a kill, and the other 2 times out of 10 you're most likely being countered or just whiff, but considering most ults in the game hardly guarantee a kill, this ultimate is pretty damn close to doing just that. And of course, if you're used to using the ult, like even just a little bit, that 8 times out of 10 is likely gonna turn into like 9.5 times out of 10. It's not like Fernando's ult is reactable, I suppose, so it's fair to leave some lenience for that, I guess. And again, if you're at least half decent at it, the kill is almost always going to be valuable, meaning even if you trade kills, a likely enough scenario since Drogos is vulnerable for the duration of the ult, is often a worthwhile trade due to how much control over the ult you have, despite its general limitations of, you know, locking you out of everything. In the long run, its potential is hard capped, like it's never going to do any more than 1 kill, but I feel the more important thing at this point in the list is that it's just incredibly consistent at getting that 1 kill. Like, at worst, you'll take out a flank, and at best, a high health front line instantly. 0 down downsides aside from the vulnerability it puts you in, which, I'll be real, it's really not that bad unless you're getting stomped or going in solo for some reason. It certainly has its counters. Fernando ult and even just Ying clones can effectively waste the entire ultimate, not to mention Xin's counter gets a pass again for some reason. There's some wacky Ray stuff that can reduce the 100% damage to a lower percentage, weird niche counter stuff, but Drogo's ult itself can be a good counter against something like Makoa ult or Amani ult for instance, so I feel that kind of sort of balances it out. Hardly any potential outside of its obvious use, but incredibly consistent and reliable if the Drogo's isn't an actual hamster.
I will not die. Not yet, amigo.
Fernando's Immortal, the premier defensive ultimate essentially, not using shields or self-buffs, but instead making you and teammates in close proximity literally invincible. Rather, allies can't be placed below 1,500 health for a grand total of 4 seconds. For the duration, Fernando is locked out of all of his abilities aside from his primary. He's also slowed a ton and CC immune. Inherently pretty busted, right? Technical invulnerability, even for a short time, like I don't need to explain why that's good. And relative to ultimates specifically, it's pretty much a counter to all of them that don't last more than 4 seconds, alongside being a counter to, you know, any other form of damage in the entire game. Finding like a consistent perfect use for it is kind of a bit tricky though. Like it's an ultimate that ideally should be used to save you and others, while at the same time it should be used to kind of aggress or make a reversal happen, as if it doesn't change the tide of battle immediately, you're kind of all just gonna die the same, since it's not like it's gonna heal you or anything. Like your team has to be reliable and put in the work to make sure you're not all just gonna die as soon as you're vulnerable again. Keep in mind, I'm not a Fernando main by any means. This is just the main use I can see for the ult. That odd mix of defensive use, but also kind of needing to be offensively used can make it a little bit awkward, definitely a bit jarring for teammates that don't know it's coming, and I do see this ultimate in particular being misused a lot, often being activated for no reason when the Fernando is alone, just so he can survive for 4 seconds and then die, staggering the entire damn team. I don't want to conclude that the ultimate's use cases are slim, because I don't really think that's true. It's just kind of tricky to find the right time to use it, compounded by how little time the ultimate is actually up for. Honestly, if it lasted up to like 6 seconds or more, it could be straight up unfair. Thus, I feel the 4-second duration keeps it from being completely crazy while still intensely powerful in the right circumstances. There really isn't any other ultimate in the entire game that allows folks to do whatever they want with pretty much zero fear of dying, even if it's just for a few seconds. Crazy potential. Consistency is up in the air since, again, it relies on your team, which on average is kind of iffy, not to mention the odd to time use cases, but its highs can legitimately be unmatched, especially when compared to other defensive ultimates. Moji's Bon Appetit kinda goes hand in hand with the Drogo's ult, very similar in concept, and in practice, Moji's ultimate is much safer to the point where it's nigh unreactable, with the drawback being the actions between when the target is turned into the treat and when the treat is actually eaten can often be a bit, like, wacky. A lot can happen, that treat's a speedy bastard. If you don't have your mobility on cooldown, you straight up can't outrun it unless you get nimble. The thing about that though, if things do get iffy, you can just kinda dip and you'll be alright. Like if things get iffy with a Drogo's ult, sure it doesn't happen too much, but if it do, you're kinda just dead. Thus, I feel the safety of Moji ult can't be understated. Your front line can be wiped out of existence right out from under your nose sometimes, and if your tank is out in the open somewhere, it's just free real estate. Since Drogo's is so reactable, it causes a lot of potential for counters. As for Moji though, the only reactable counter is resilience itself, which reduces the amount of time the target remains a treat from a dastardly 4 seconds to a minimum of 2. And I'ma keep it a buck, that 2 seconds is still plenty of time to consume that tasty boy or dip from danger. Like it really isn't gonna change much, I feel. I'm not gonna pretend you aren't gonna end up trading. For instance, after you kill a tank, you are sometimes gonna get killed yourself for sure. That's pretty much the risk reward of any ult, but again, due to the safety, it's way easier to pick and choose times where you'll end up just fine. Not to mention more consistently pick up kills on tanks. As with Drogo's and others in the same vein, you gotta start the ult, react to everyone's reaction to the ult. Sometimes if you can't get to the tank in time, you have to settle for like a support or a damage. Still good, but less consistent at getting what you want. Something Moji doesn't nearly have as much difficulty with. It has somewhat unbridled safety that makes it legitimately feel like one of the most unfair ultimates in the entire game. Definitely not saying it is, it just certainly feels like that sometimes.
Try and run.
Ganessa's Headhunter. Okay, this is actually a pretty interesting ult. Every ultimate in the game has some kind of inherent downside or like slight unsafety. Even with ults that have tiny startups, like the startup is still there, making it even a tiny bit risky to go for. I know it really doesn't make a huge difference compared to those, but Ganessa's has like 0 drawbacks. It doesn't lock you out of anything. You technically don't even have to use it while it's up. All it does is enhance your regular primary, so it doesn't change anything. It has 0 startup or end lag. It's the safest ult in the entire game in that regard. The effect itself induces the upper half of enemy bodies to take 50% more damage from Ganessa's primary. Take note though that this 50% extra damage is actually independent of the usual headshot multiplier, meaning that with a fully charged shot of the primary scoped variant, lower half body shots deal the usual 1200 damage, upper half body shots will do the ultimate induced 50% extra damage, dealing 1800, and lastly headshots will deal the usual headshot multiplier of 50% extra damage alongside the ultimate induced 50% extra damage, dealing the highest possible damage of 2400 in a single shot. Pretty substantial considering that's enough to one-shot every single champion that isn't a tank, and isn't, well, Lilith. There's probably some inconsistencies to that broad statement, but my point is, that's a lot of damage, especially in a game where one-shotting kind of just doesn't happen. The ultimate's primary enhancement lasts 5 whole seconds, and alongside that, your scope shots charge 50% faster. The DPS is a little strange to measure, but the duration just allows you to shoot 5 fully charged shots. It's not guaranteed or anything that you'll get 5 shots out or that you'll hit them all, but if I were to measure the theoretical high potential, assuming you hit all 5 shots on the body, you can deal up to 9,000 damage in total. If you somehow manage to hit all 5 headshots in a row, I don't know, maybe Yaggorath put down a controller or some shit, the ult can do up to a maximum of 12,000 damage. That often matches the health pool of the entire enemy team. Now obviously you're not going to see team wipes with this ult normally, but it's extremely controlled and high damage makes its potential pretty damn scary. Its safety is prevalent for sure, although inherently you are still sniping, and it's very obvious when you ult. The enemy can hide much easier than if you are all up in their face doing damage by different means, but in any case the ult is obviously great offensively as well as defensively, as all of the damage modifications still work for Kinessa's non-scoped primary, which honestly can be pretty good for offense as well as defense. But yeah, crazy potential. It's pretty intuitive all things considered, and its consistency solely relies on player skill, but keep in mind all ults that rely on player skill, that means that there is a ton of people out there that get really good with this kind of ult, and will push it to way greater lengths than ultimates that don't have that much potential.
You are not welcome here!
Inara's Seismic Crash. Inara's ultimate is the first really good instance of a true mass setup ult on this list. I feel like the fact that this is the first one and it's this high up really reflects just how good those kinds of ultimates really are. The only thing really similar previously was Rom's, but that one's harder to set up stuff with, definitely more for damage. Meanwhile, Inara's is almost strictly for setups, whether that be setting up for general damage or even other ultimates and whatnot, aka inherently very powerful for that alone. Despite the relatively high startup, this ultimate is very easily controlled, and although it's clearly reactable, it's still a bit of a gambit on where exactly the staff stun is going to be thrown. The stun radius is huge, dealing 500 damage and stunning for 2 seconds, which is the largest amount of time any ultimate stuns for in the entire game, if you don't count Io's wackiness, I suppose. But yes, very simple, gets the job done for the most part, good for stalling too. Does make you a very big target on activation, meaning you will likely be put down if you pop it at low health. It's really not that great for saving you, I suppose. It is also countered by resilience as usual, but an AoE stun is still likely to hit 1 or 2 folks who don't have full resilience, so it's still definitely worth its while. It's a really good ult, great control over the stun, lots of potential, and I'd say some pretty decent consistency ignoring the obvious resilience counter. Eevee's Ice Storm. Similar to Inara's ultimate in a sense, this ultimate is even more restrictive for enemies, but at a much smaller scale. That being said, the storm still covers a large area, slowing for 60% movement speed, dealing 40 damage every quarter second for a maximum damage of 960, and crippling for the entire 6-second duration. It can be used on reaction, which binds perfectly since it avoids any instance of, oh, I'll just press F and escape, both before and during the ultimate, leaving anyone caught in the storm extremely vulnerable, albeit they still have the ability to attack while caught. That's not really a problem for Eevee though, since she's so mobile she can kind of just appear, drop in, peace out. Plus, unlike Inara, Eevee actually does deal sizable damage, so she can take much more advantage of her ultimate than most tanks or supports. Despite not straight up stunning, the ult does technically keep enemies stuck for longer than general stunning ultimates as well, even if resilience does pretty much negate the slow just like stuns. Its highs without the effect of resilience are higher than generic mass stun ultimates, but its lows are actually likely a bit lower. But yeah, for pretty much any character that isn't a tank, if your team notices them caught in the storm, it's pretty much a death sentence. And considering flanks specialize in taking out enemies that are out of place, it's even useful without any help from your team. Meanwhile, with help from your team and multiple enemies caught in the storm's large radius, it can be pretty devastating, consistently resulting in 1 or more kills, if not some pretty resounding damage on a tank. Future me here, I forgot to mention her talent, so I'll do that quick. Snow Globe doubles the ult's damage while halving its length, as well as its charge time. It's really quite useful to have the cripple out a bit more, and the doubling of its marginal damage is more helpful than it might seem at first glance. It doesn't nerf the ult like Barrick's similar ult talent either, making it a more variable, if occasionally a bit neutral of an option.
A dance of life and death.
Caspian Storm of Blades. Oddly, this ult kind of falls in line with Victor's ult, however this ultimate has even more control than Victor's at the cost of a tiny bit less damage, and of course the huge AoE. The AoE this ult provides is much more of the piercing variety, which is still useful for sure. The hitboxes are pretty big, but not as useful as just how custom you can be with this ultimate. Using this ultimate creates, with very little startup or lag I should mention, these 5 sword projectiles that are fired off alongside the use of Caspian's primary or secondary abilities, aka his gun and his sword. If hit, each sword projectile deals 800 damage, not including the damage you'll be inflicting with his gun or his sword, meaning you're more likely going to be doing up to 1,150 per shot for 5 shots. This completely shreds basically any opposing champion if you can hit all of them, even tanks. Like, it's pretty nutty. You could do it all at a drop of the hat, just reacting to anything. All that without the vulnerability that, say, Victor's would give. You're only as vulnerable as Caspian's usual state would be, as you're not locked out of any of his abilities for the duration of the ult. The duration these swords stay available to you is 10 seconds, giving you plenty of time to plan out your attacks, just spam them out, or use other abilities first, whatever you choose to do really. They can be a little bit weird to hit as the sword projectiles are different for your actual gun projectiles and obviously your secondary sword, but that's really the only downside. Again, this ult only leaves you as vulnerable as your general Caspian play would allow you to be, which considering the subtleties of that does make it harder to rank for sure. At the end of the day though, this ult does up to 4,000 damage, not including the damage of your primary and secondary themselves, and including those would amount to upwards of 5,750 damage. Again, if all shots are hit, with its piercing nature essentially being the cherry on top. Huge potential with its consistency completely reliant on player skill.
Come on, let's fight!
Ashes assert dominance. Depot's Moai statue noise accompanying. Oh shit, I forgot this ult when I said that Fernando's was the premier defensive ult. Oops. I guess it's safe to say Fernando's is the GOAT when it comes to protecting the entire team for a short period of time. Meanwhile, Ashe's ultimate is much easier to pull off well, as it produces an even more potent invincibility on only Ashe herself. The funny hop that ensues the ult is a wacky instance of something you want to shorten as much as possible, as the hop is the only reactable precursor to the ult, and the last time she's fully vulnerable, meaning likely many attempts to kill her or stun her will commence in an attempt to prevent her from actually hitting the ground and activating the ult for real. When it actually does land though, the ult will deal 600 damage and stun for 2 seconds in a small-ish radius around her, comparatively of course. Pretty easy to dodge if in the open, but unreactable if the initial hop is under a short ceiling. As such, the stun definitely varies in its usefulness. Apart from that lackluster stuff though, as long as she remains in that zone, she is completely damage immune for the remaining 8 seconds of the ultimate. Granted, Ashe isn't going to be wreaking absolute havoc on the enemy team. She doesn't exactly have the damage capabilities to do that, but she certainly makes her presence known, especially with all her CC. It's not like a Makoa ult where you can technically deal with it. Makoas can get countered and stuff, plus just general damage, but for Ashe, she's kind of just there. You don't really have a choice, you just kind of have to accept it. Okay, that's technically not true. As she isn't CC immune, you can knock her out of it with CC and stuff, but she still has the option to just, you know, walk back into the circle. It's not like it's disappearing anytime soon. And it's likely she'll be healed when she's safe again if she's not killed outright, so just knocking her out of the circle isn't always as potent of a counter. On a point fight especially, 8 seconds is a long time to have the most important section of the map essentially shut down. It's great for stalling, great for pushing advantage or evading disadvantage and whatnot, and if you jump the gun and realize you're gonna die right after the zone ends, you can relatively safely retreat out of the damage immune radius with her mobility. Kind of similar to how Moji's ultimate is the safest of the executes, this ultimate is the safest of the defensive ultimates. Intensely controllable, you can leave the damage immune circle any point you desire. I think of it as a much simpler and easier to successfully use version of Fernando's ultimate. Fernando's has much more potential for sure, but Ashe's is much more consistent, and can be used relatively well in extra areas where Fernando's will often be wasted. Cassie's Scout. Essentially being able to view the state and positioning of both your team and the enemy team is beyond broken. Like imagine a sniper with the ability to tell exactly where the enemy is and exactly when and where to peek. Maybe an ulting Drogos knowing exactly where the enemy tank is. Maybe a flank knowing exactly when to pick off enemy stragglers with zero worry of being bursted out of existence. Stuff like that makes this ultimate pretty obviously very powerful. I'm saying all that, but obviously this ultimate isn't particularly broken, as the mass reveal only lasts a mere 8 seconds. Everything I just mentioned that could be absolutely terrifying wouldn't be very likely to happen in that span of time, especially not all at once. It certainly can, but not only do you have to rely on your own awareness in order to make sure your team can actually pull it off, you also have to actually rely on your team to, you know, pull it off. It is absolutely not guaranteed by any means. For instance, even just a Cassie and a sniper being on the same team isn't exactly a common occurrence. Regardless though, no matter who you are, nearly everything becomes so much easier as soon as the Cassie ult comes online. Like it's one of the biggest conveniences that you're like, oh man, when it goes away. Its potential is beyond huge, but in mostly passive and relatively inconsistent ways. Cassie herself also does gain a few buffs while the ultimate is active, gaining 30% movement speed and 20% attack speed. Certainly welcome buffs, allowing the one in control of the ultimate to begin with a bit more ability to take advantage of it. Again though, it's very passive. This ultimate will not save you, and every bit of advantage potentially enabled from its use must be earned by you and your team. And to make it as effective and broken as it might be, you have to be very aware of your team and the enemy team. Or at least your team has to be trustworthy enough to actually be able to make those crazy plays as soon as the ult comes online. Even in marginal and general amounts though, the help it could potentially give really can't be understated, even if it's just something as simple as giving you 1 or 2 less things to think about during a scuffle. Not to mention this one doesn't really have any main counters, unlike Maeve's ult for example. It's extremely helpful for the entire team and can often cause the enemy to simply feel like hiding behind cover in a safe space until it's over, which I suppose technically is its only real counter. Ying's Illusory Rift. Illusory? Is that a word? Okay, Ying's ult is kind of in the midst of some changes right now. Like apparently it now grants everyone CC immunity for 1 second at the time this video is out for Hexsec. And it'll likely change even more in the near future, so I'll talk about this ult more generally just as the big global healing ult, less speaking on subtleties because I don't understand them. Despite being counterable by a base mechanic, this is a much more active global ultimate than Cassie's. As a result, it's going to be helping out in a much more consistent fashion, even if less potential is present. This ultimate globally heals allies for 600 health per second second. For reference, Ceres heals for 1500 health every 1.5 seconds. For another example, Io heals for 150 every 0.15 seconds with her whole channeling meter heal thing. I could bring up more, but I don't want to put that much effort into a single entry in like 60 entries. This video is already long enough. Comparing Ying's ultimate to those two pretty basic healing ultimates shows that Ying's ult heals a little more than half a normal heal ability, but does so consistently for the ultimate's 8-second duration. Very substantial and very difficult for the enemy team to deal with depending on the anti-heal level. Early to mid-game, this can be really useful offensively, as it makes even low health characters feel super tanky to go up against, and thus giving a lot of advantage that allies can push if they're paying attention. In that sense, I suppose it can be great both defensively and aggressively. Even late game when healing is less potent, the ever-consistent nature of the heal means that allies who need heals simply ought to not get shot for 1.5 seconds in order to get a full swift heal, rather than doing so and having to spam VHS, assuming the healer isn't dead and is in a good place to heal you. In other words, the heal can still be pretty useful late game. It's not the best at it, I suppose, but it's still a very sought after trait for healing in general, as long as your team is paying attention. Oh yeah, and true healing is a thing, but I have no clue the subtleties of that mechanic, so I'm not going to talk about it. Okay, we bomb. So, albeit much more useful before anti-heal is in effect, still quite consistently useful alongside some half-decent potential. Oh, and also Ying can teleport to anyone during her ult, which I think is pretty cool. It also doesn't just disappear when she dies, which is a relatively rare trait when it comes to global ultimates, and I suppose ultimates in general now that I think about it. Cons overpower. Oddly enough, a lot of the best executes in the game aren't even executes. Okay, so pretty much, take Moji's ult, take the iffy wackiness of it and replace it with a longer and more varying time of death, and make it so it can be activated, like, literally anywhere. If I were to guess, probably about as consistent at getting a kill as Drogo's ult. And with Con ult, that's minus any kind of overextending or anything like that. Instead, all that unsafeness is replaced with waggling the target enemy in front of your allies' faces until they realize they have to shoot it. Of course, if you have line of sight with the edge of the map or an insta-kill environmental hazard, it's a free kill. Nearly 100% consistency on that front. It's kind of like Yaggroths, I guess. You grab them from pretty much anywhere, and the health pool the enemy has to drain is just Con's actual health. But of course, the time the quote-unquote execute and kill is much shorter. I keep calling Con's ult an execute. It's not. It's just a grab with melee Marth hitboxes, but it does effectively work like an execute that can be executed from almost anywhere in line of sight, and you can move around while you're waiting for the target to die. More than likely being a tank, you're surrounded by your team, so it is pretty safe to pull off. Meanwhile, the target enemy is safe to die pretty quickly. It's so consistent that it's one of those ultimates that feels just kind of unfair sometimes. Like that dread of how the hell was I supposed to react or do anything to avoid that kind of sets in. It's one of those similar feelings to the Torvald ult, where people going against Con just kind of end up guessing that he has the ult online, and once they've kind of figured that out, they just try to stay out of line of sight of the enemy Con. Like, really, that's the only counter to not getting hit by it. Well, I guess that's not technically true. It is countered as usual by resilience, but at full resilience, the holding portion is reduced from 5 seconds to little less than 3 seconds. Definitely still seems like enough to get a tank down in health pretty far, let alone a squishy, and even if it doesn't, the throw at the end of the ult, if you decide to throw them early, still deals 700 damage to the person thrown, as well as an extra 700 to anyone hit by the flying dude, or turtle or whatever. The ease of picking and choosing which enemy you want to kill alongside its consistency makes this probably the best quote-unquote execute the game has to offer. The potential is very clear-cut, like you're not getting any more than one kill, maybe an extra 700 damage to whoever you throw the dude at, but the consistency is like the maximum it could be, again, as long as you don't miss like a fucking hamster. Bomb King's King Bomb, the huge AoE payoff ultimate that kind of meshes some utility and setup with it as well. The ult deals 2,500 damage straight up, pretty standard for ults like this, and more than enough to finish off squishies, but it also stuns for an entire 2 seconds. And need I mention, stuns are pretty powerful. The movement, although telling and exploitable, does help him get past the enemy lines relatively fast, alongside that little mix-up that you can do with Poppy Bomb, which, even if everybody knows the mix-up exists, does make it more variable and harder to expect. Not to mention, like said, the approaching roll is exploitable, but at the same time, really scary to try taking out. With Betty, her launching the actual rocket is pretty reactable. BK's actual explosion, though, is immediate and unreactable, alongside the initial portion of the ult's erratic movement. Like, you can maybe take him out, but you want to stay a ways away while you're doing so. That being said, the damage falloff is pretty harsh, harsher than most AoE explosion ults, but, you know, stun. Even if you end up just hitting one person at the edge of the ult, you're still probably going to end up killing them due to that stun. Bomb King's damage is pretty harsh, you could probably take out a couple by himself. The ult has really good snowball potential, like you could kill someone with the initial explosion, then kill another who might have been caught with the stun, and that's you by yourself. With an entire team to take advantage of the stun, it could lead to even more kills, or at least more consistent kills. As usual, stuns can be countered by resilience, but at the end of the day, the stun is still just a backup effect from a one-shotting explosion, so it's by no means hard countered. The only reason it's not higher is because of the exploitable and highly reactable startup, and because the explosion has pretty high fall-off compared to most ults of this type. But yeah, not the most consistent in the world, but pretty good. Has very high potential and is very scary to hear coming, especially with its various ult tunes going on. Some are definitely more intimidating than others. Okay, after like an hour or so, we are finally at the top 10. I don't know if there's a specific point in my lists when the alts started kind of going crazy, but suffice it to say, these alts go crazy. So here they are, in my opinion, the top 10 alts in the entire game. First off, counting down the top 10 is Ruckus's Hexafire. It feels kind of silly to put this ult this high just because it does a lot of damage. Like, it feels somewhat similar to the idea of calling Sky's ultimate OP just because it goes big boom, but really, this ultimate is much more usable. It has a chunk of startup remedied by just how fast it drains health pools. The ult deals 3000 damage per second with its miniguns, plus an additional 1000 per second with those inaccurate missiles. He goes ham for 4 seconds, meaning his ultimate's highest damage possible is 12,000 damage. Future me here, it's actually 16,000. Math is hard, okay? And for reference, that's the most damage recovered on this list by a long shot. The only ult coming in kind of close is Kinessa, and only if she hits all headshots. But can you guess what's way easier than hitting only headshots with Kinessa ult? Hitting your shots normally with Ruckus ult, and Ruckus can deal all that within 4 seconds. Although he is quite vulnerable during the ult, as it does slow him down to an absolute crawl, it's often very scary to challenge this ult regardless, as it legit kills squishies in like half a second if Ruckus just looks at them. Future me again here, I feel like I really didn't stress just how vulnerable he is in this state. The risk is definitely offset by just how much damage he does. You really don't want to challenge it and get his attention while the ult is going on, or else you just kind of die. He can still be overwhelmed though, as he still might not be able to kill everyone else before they kill him. And if that's the case, he's extremely easy to kill due to how stationary he is. Not to mention, of course, the 1 second of pre-fire doesn't make it any easier for the Ruckus. But of course, that's what you gotta do in order to balance the, quite frankly, insane damage. That's really all it needs to be this high. People will find a way to use this ult optimally, and thus its insane potential will be utilized. I guess I should mention he also gains 10% DR for this ult's duration. It's not a lot, but everything counts. Oftentimes, the best choice of action to deal with this ult is just to wait it out if possible, as it is certainly reactable. I think I'll stop saying at the end of segments here how much potential the ult could have, as every ult coming up has quite literally unquantifiable potential at this point. Consistency is still important though, and this ult has some of the lesser consistency compared to ults this high on the list. Oh, it can be cancelled too, which is useful. Tyra's Crossfire. At this point I've said most of what I can say about these primary enhancing ultimates. Tyra's ultimate just has the best spread of abilities out of those kinds of ults in my opinion. It has near the safety of Kinessa's, meanwhile Tyra actually has the kit for being up in the enemy's face all the time. To some extent I guess it has the faster fire rate of Bucks while not being as detrimental if you miss a shot or two, and it has the reactability and ease of outputting the damage that Caspian has. Some of those other ults I just mentioned might share a few of those other good traits with each other, but Tyra's has pretty much all of them, or at the very least all the best qualities, alongside straight up doing more damage than all of them if you hit your shots. Minus Kinessa's ult if every shot is a headshot, I suppose. It's such an easy ult to pop as soon as a good situation is presented, and Tyra is often in a situation where she can really push up, getting kills and putting pressure on the enemy team, while doing hella damage and moving hella fast, making her surprisingly hard to punish. To be more specific, the ult gives Tyra 40% faster fire rate and 40% movement speed for 4.5 seconds, dealing up to, and again this is the highest theoretical damage possible, everyone's gonna miss some shots, but its highest damage possible would be 9,580 damage. Great for taking out numerous squishies or maybe just a tank and then some. There's just so much potential with this ultimate, and as far as these kinds of ults go, it's likely the most intuitive and simple to use, meaning it'll apply to even more situations and likely be used well over a wider spread of high to low level. Ray's Vivify. Like I said before, healing ultimates are really weird. I could see this being a bit high in some folks' eyes, but at the same time, its uncauterizable set healing of 75% maximum health alongside 100% damage immunity for a large chunk of time. It's kind of like a negative execute if you want to stretch it, though it might be more accurate to say it's as potent as a Terminus ult, trading the explosion for 2 seconds of DR, a much more useful attribute. Not to mention it can actually save 2 people, yourself and whoever you're linked with. Plus you actually get to choose who you save. This ult could almost literally power you in your pocket through almost anything, minus heavy CC. Hopefully it's pretty obvious why this ult is so good. Crazy DR, crazy control over who you save, intense consistency, super easy to use, saves 2 people instead of the average executes single kill if you want to use that comparison. Just the idea of being able to freely save a tank and a support from certain death is beyond important. And I mean that's only one of its better uses. Saving anyone is important really. There aren't really any downsides either, aside from looking like a fool if you forget to link to somebody while you ult. Even if something like that happens though, big deal, you just gave yourself the ability to survive anything for 2 seconds. Because you messed up the ult. I know I said Kinessa's ult is the safest in terms of startup, not locking you out of abilities and whatnot, but I think it's pretty clear Ray's is realistically the safest since that's kind of the point of the entire ult. The cons might guarantee a kill, but you know, Ray nearly guarantees 2 saves, alongside even more lenience to do so on top of that. This ult can nearly beat out any other ult in this list if used right. That by itself doesn't mean it's better than all of them, it's just a fun thing to think about and certainly pertains to its merit. Supreme consistency if you don't forget to press Q, still will only ever save 2 allies including yourself, but honestly that's way more potential than any other ultimate as guaranteed, or at least nearly as guaranteed as Ray's.
Interesting.
Pip's Evil mojo. I feel like this is the first large-scale AoE attack that is actually consistently associated with mass death, aka this is more or less where we get to the ults that could somewhat feasibly team wipe, or at least take out a few folks on a regular basis. Pip's the start here in that regard, as although his ult acts as a grand equalizer, it does have the most problems out of its little group of the scariest ultimates in the game. The ult has low startup and shoots an AoE lobbing projectile, turning all hit into chickens, specifically chickens with 1500 health, although the transformation also does deal 200 damage, so really more or less it starts them out at 1300 health. The chickenification lasts for a pretty damn long 4 seconds. The foul creatures, see what it did there, are fast little bastards, and there's really zero way to know which chicken is which character if you're late to the party. In other words, if you're aiming for a tank and you happen to hit 1 or 2 extra enemies, it's pretty easy to lose track of who's who, and if you can't kill them all, a tank or whoever you might want dead just might get away. This ult also has the incredibly rare trait of potentially helping the enemy. 1500 health isn't exactly small, it's pretty easy to get a champion below that without them dying, and then if they get chickenified while below that threshold, you as the enemy effectively heal them. And again, they're fast fucking bastards, bro might get away all thanks to you. It sounds unlikely, but honestly, it's happened to me a pretty decent amount of times recently. It's not the most common occurrence, but it happens. Now, despite all that goofy shit, it does unreactively turn everybody grouped up into defenseless chickens with small health pools for a damn long time. It's very reasonable to assume most of the chickens will die, likely meaning at the very least a few deaths. Among all these ults with really high potential that we're kind of getting into now, there's always going to be risk, like Pip's ult is not guaranteed to kill anyone obviously, but the important thing is that getting multiple kills due to this ult, and all ults this high for that matter, isn't an unjustified expectation. Like, it's consistent enough. These are the ults that give the most options and the highest possibility for changing the entire state of the game, and not just changing the outcome of 1v1s or small skirmishes, even though obviously they would certainly do great in those areas too. For this ult specifically, with Pip as a healer for the most part, the ult has its merits to be used defensively as well as offensively. It can be countered by resilience, and has a lot of weirdness I mentioned above, and probably a lot more honestly, but I certainly feel its potential is pretty telling to its being this high. Also, keep in mind I'm not saying ults previous to this can't consistently kill multiple enemies. What I'm implying is I personally feel this is the threshold to where many enemy deaths become more commonplace for the ults, and even expected in circumstances. Maldamba's Dread Serpent. One of the most classic examples of a great setup ultimate. It's hardly reactable for the most part, it has terrific control over where it's placed, it can be activated mid-flight, it has absolutely wild range, and has quite the large radius of effect that can actually stick around for quite a bit longer than it might seem sometimes. Meaning, as the enemy, you can still accidentally run into the fear circle and feel like an idiot as you die because you're an idiot. That being said, you can only be feared once, of course. Apparently you get over it pretty quick, in which case afterward you can just kind of hang out in the circle and you're fine. Like said, the effect cause is a fear, triggering all enemies to slowly and uncontrollably run away from the ult circle for 2 seconds, making this ult the first and one of only 3 causes of fear in the entire game. It's a little unintuitive as a setup ultimate, since everyone is running away from the center of the source of CC. It's not as simple to punish as a Saris ult or anything. It's a little more convoluted, and a little harder to take full advantage of the short period of time all enemies are indisposed. Aside from that, there really isn't too much more to say. Like usual, it can be countered by resilience, but the heavy control this ult gives over the battlefield is self-evident, and will almost always need to be respected, as each individual affected can be taken advantage of by anyone on Maldamba's team. Whether defensively, aggressively, or in neutral, it really doesn't matter. Terrific and quite literally terrifying ultimate. Genos's Through Time and Space. Might be a bit surprising this is this high, I suppose, but in my opinion, this is the ultimate with the highest possible reward for how much effort you actually put in. The ult can be used completely safely, from behind walls or just away from the enemy, and despite that, it's extremely intuitive and easy to aim. Most ults in this genre of ultimate, if you will, need to be placed down in the middle of danger, or ridden into danger, or rolled into danger. This ult, on the other hand, goes, I'm just looking that direction, no big deal, as it unleashes the largest area covering ultimate in the entire game that one-shots any champion that isn't a tank. The ult does, very specifically I might mention, 2650 damage for some reason, and comes out 1.2 seconds after the indication. The fuse time is the shortest for doing as much damage as it does, and it's just enough time for you to react, but just not enough time to think very clearly about what to do. If you're caught in the middle, there isn't enough time to walk out of it, meaning often a panic mobility ability is used instead, potentially putting you in a bad spot, or accidentally not even moving you out of the ult itself, due to it inducing quite the panic. In other words, it's just fast enough to cause a lot of mistakes. Sometimes it's also hard to tell if you're in the ult's path at all. Sometimes you just get clipped without even realizing it. Sometimes you think you're out of it and totally fine just to get blasted through time and space. It's the absolute best and most consistent ultimate that you kind of just throw out there. And without setups and just a little bit of positional awareness of yourself in the opposition, it's pretty damn often you'll net yourself a kill or two. It's definitely the ultimate I've gone up against that's inflicted the most situations of, wow, my whole entire team is dead now due to a well-placed ult. what do I do? And that's without any kind of setup. Actually using this in combination with a setup ultimate is potent, as any good ult combo would be, but Genos' ult is just fast enough and covers just enough space to make it easier than pretty much any other, making it much more feasible even with impromptu reactions to like a Saris ult without even using a VC. It's one of those ults that constantly catches you off guard and hardly leaves any room to breathe. You need to react properly and fast, or unless you're a tank, you just kind of die. It kind of makes the most checkmate scenarios as well, as if you have no mobility left and are stuck in a room, there's really nothing to do. It's unexpected, often comes out of nowhere, and has no right being as scary or consistent as it is. Androxus is a cursed arm. Mainly, this ult is variable. It's like a sky bomb sliced up into small portions. It can be used for its usual intent of blasting the heck out of people grouped up or in bad positions, but can also be used in 1v1s or smaller scuffles to great effect, or even just to guarantee a single kill and then some, even on a tank for the most part. There's a short pre-fire before giving access to 4 projectile shots, dealing 1000 damage each in an AoE. It can also be cancelled between any of the shots, which is especially important for this ultimate as it's often used for minor things like I said, as when you're done with those small scuffles, there's no point in using the rest of your shots, so it allows you to simply save some ult charge. Extra options, have your ult up more variability. It's extremely flexible in how the damage can be used, kind of similar to ultimates such as Tiberius's and Shaolin's among others, but with the intense AoE damage of an ultimate like Sky, Victor, or Caspian. This ult can do pretty much anything for you at the cost of doing a little less damage than most ults at the top of the list. And by doing a little less damage, I mean spurts of damage amounting to 4,000. Obviously nothing to scoff at. There just isn't an ult as flexible as this one, while also staying just as deadly. Himani's Dragon's Call. Oh boy, this one has a lot to it. Unlike where Androxus' ultimate is super variable and does a ton of stuff other ultimates do just better, Himani's is like in a whole nother ballpark where it doesn't do what other ultimates do, but there isn't any other ult that does what Imani's does. The respect you have to give this damn dragon surpasses any other ultimate in the entire game. It's not like something you place down that you kinda need to deal with, and if you don't, you take some damage or be slowed or something. This ult, if your entire team doesn't collectively try to deal with it, whether that be by your entire team blasting the dragon enough to kill it, or flanking to kill Imani yourself where the rest of the team distracts, you all just kinda die. The dragon deals 1700 damage per second in this AoE flame cone kinda deal. I swear it used to have more, but these days it actually only has 6000 health, a little less than I thought. But if the dragon is set out optimally, it's still not like you can kill it fast. It's the most insane area denying thing in the entire game. You can't get near this thing or you will die. Even if it's slow as shit, you gotta respect it. Like, I really don't know to what extent this thing could actually be used as. It could be used on the focal point of whatever game state you're currently in, but also it's a great distraction and baiting tool since everyone is hyper aware of the fact that they gotta deal with it or die. To be honest, I don't even know if the ult is diverse in its usage. Like, you can't really set up anything into it or use it on reaction or anything. It's just so scary in how it's used, I guess. You can't afford to play games against it even if it's easy to see coming. Even if it's clunky to move around, you have to deal with it or hide for the entire, 20 seconds that it's out? Some ults cause stalling for a mere 4 seconds or whatever, and that's, like, good. That's useful. This ult is just beyond powerful in everything that it does well, as long as you can pull it off. Mainly, this ult is pretty tricky to use for the Imani. Often it's easy to tell where Imani locked herself down during the ult, and as such, killing her isn't a big deal. If Imani starts the ult quite far away in a safe area, not only is it telling of where she is based on where the dragon is coming from, it's also pretty easy to take the dragon out before it gets to the battlefield in that case. It's still useful as a distraction in that regard. In fact, for all I know, that could be its primary use, but it's still far from its full potential. Like said, the dragon is clunky to move around, has odd blind spots that is hard to reach with his Frostfire attack. It even gets hard countered by Bulldozer of all things. But aside from all that stuff that's pretty inherent to ults that need this much safety in order to use, if you're actually able to pull it off and be slick about it, maybe take advantage of a dead flank on the other team, I don't know. The potential, man, the potential. Like, some characters just can't even escape at certain times. Imani ult feels like an actual boss fight at times. It's kinda hype. And as a fun thought, I know this would absolutely never happen, but the maximum possible damage this ultimate could put out, not including the fact that it's AoE, in which case it would do even more, 34,000 damage, dwarfing any other damage ability probably in the entire game, if somehow it was able to stay alive for the full 20 seconds and was constantly hitting somebody. Like I said, it's not going to happen, but I don't know, it's cool to think about. Anyways, the ultimate with the scariest potential, maybe in the entire game. The only reason it can be easy to take out at times is because it's so obvious that your entire team can see it, and thus they'll all want to take it out immediately due to the respect that it requires. It's incredibly easy to see coming, of course, but its health and damage makes it pretty much impossible to challenge solo, and if it actually does manage to get in, you pretty much just have to run. Even if it does its job half well, it's still probably one of the best ults out there, and balanced out to an extent by just how difficult it can be to create a perfect situation for this ult to thrive. Alright, now we are on to the top two that I think are pretty clear cut. Realistically, I think these two are pretty similar in very different ways, and I could see an argument for either of these being the best, but my personal pick for the second best ultimate in the game is...
Show them no mercy.
Furia's Inflame. Any ability that increases the damage of another character has always been implemented extremely sparingly, and I can think of only a few times over the lifespan of the entire game that such things have been implemented, and even some of those limited examples have been patched out of the game entirely, possibly because of how difficult they are to balance. But I think this ult is a great example of why it should be treated with such caution. A global ultimate buffing all allies' damage, increasing their damage by 30% for 7 seconds. That changes so much about the game at base that I'd be a fool to even try listing it off. Like, characters that get killed in 4 shots by another character might just suddenly be able to die in 3. Abilities that may be just about 1 shot now do. Character counters suddenly aren't quite as consistent. Ultimates become even more deadly. Your health starts dropping like the time to kill is at the level of fucking Destiny 2. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but unlike previous global ultimates like Cassie's, you can't always use the ability to see characters through walls. On the other hand, doing damage is pretty common, I'd say. The thought I had for Cassie's was its uses are great, but it's not often that those great uses will all line up perfectly for the short period of time that the ult is up, and as a result, it's not that consistent. Furia's ult will never be unuseful in pretty much any situation while keeping the same highs. Any character can step up during its duration to make some kind of impact on the match. It literally gives your entire team an unfair advantage that's extremely easy to push. Even if Buddy in the corner is doing his usual non-aggressing lowest bar of his job, he'll still be taking advantage of the ult. It's passive, so it's not like it's guaranteed to change the course of the match every time it pops, but even though it relies on your team who might be just a bunch of bozos at level 20, it affects everything so integral to the game itself, it'll more than likely still pull its weight. It even has a 2-second period before the ult comes out, not only letting your team know it's going to happen so everyone is more prepared, which really doesn't happen much outside of voice chats. Furia also happens to be completely damage immune for the whole pre-fire, just for a little bit more added defensive utility, and it's a good defensive utility. On top of that, Furia also gains 30% movement speed for the entire ult, not only allowing her to defensively run away, but also even allowing her to push advantage as a support if she so desires. The only way to really mess this ult up is if you pop it while your entire team's dead, which in that case, I don't know what to tell you, don't do that. But that's it. It has a little bit of a smaller global range, I guess, but you'll be scraping at straws trying to find anything too terrible about this ability. Its consistency is nigh unparalleled alongside the insane potential that all these top tier ults have. And finally, I can take a breath. Number 1. Again, I could see either this ultimate or number 2 being the best in the game, but in my opinion, the only ultimate that ekes it out over Furia's is Seris's homophobic convergence. Sorry, I can't help myself. Probably the single most obvious and common immediate thought when thinking of powerful ultimates. Like said, I see Furia's and Seris's ultimate to be a cut above the rest, so I am going to be doing a lot of comparisons here between the two. Even if Furia's is high because of the myriad of possible uses to the point where it's difficult for me to fathom all that clearly, Seris's ultimate is way more direct in its usage, and although still relies on the team, meaning a bit more inconsistency at best, it also adds the most potential, as this ult is essentially handing your allies ease of access to the immobilized enemy on a silver platter. It literally couldn't make it easier. Furia's ultimate makes your allies passively monsters, but Seris's jumps the complication of how reliable your team is by making your enemies so useless, exposed, and out of place that I feel anyone at all could easily take advantage of the ult. Meanwhile, that's if your team is unreliable. If your team is actually reliable, this ult simply becomes a swift death for anybody affected, while Furia's doesn't inherently do anything to help you catch the enemy. They can still run, escape, and camp out the effect. In my opinion, affecting the enemy team harshly, especially in a way that they have no control over, is better than affecting your allies or even yourself. Stripping control essentially, like your team has control of your team, obviously. What's better than that? Well, taking control of the enemy team, which to some extent, that's exactly what Seris ult does. So yeah, while I do think Furia's ult does outplay Seris with its potential, Seris's is much better at consistently making team killing plays. Furia's is terrific at passively turning the tide of battle, meanwhile Seris does so quite directly, and I would say more consistently, even if what the ult affects isn't quite as consistent. Like, Seris could miss, Furia really can't. Even so, Seris also has a simple kit that can easily take advantage of the ult, her primary pierces everyone involved, and can deal more damage later with her Q. Not a ton of damage, but it's super intuitive and does what it needs to do. Both Seris and Furia's ultimates are also great defensively, which is awesome for supports in general. Seris's ult is also, like, really fast. There's always a little bit of time before it hits the ground, but when it does, a 0.5 second fuse is activated, hardly making it easily reactable. It has a deceptively large radius, often managing to snag folks even while they're trying to escape with their mobilities and whatnot. Not to mention it even has a bit of the Makoa hook effect, resisting a little bit of resilience. In other words, even if that 1.4 second stun can be reduced with resilience, that initial catch and drag that the ult employs isn't really affected. I almost forgot to even mention this in the segment, but this is the absolute premier setup ultimate for other ults. Like, when you think of ult combos in general, this is the ult you immediately think of. And if you're actually able to set up a combo, whether that be with voice chats or even without voice chats, considering how fast this ult is, other ults just suddenly become beyond busted if used together. It quote-unquote buffs other ults more sparingly than Furia's technically, but if set up, Seris just lets you use any other damaging ult on everyone. Like, you can just do it. Bar some prep time, of course, but you get what I mean. And even there's some pretty fast ults out there like Hi-Rez and Caspians that can take advantage of it pretty well, with zero setup in mind beforehand. beforehand. So kind of as an aside, his potential by itself may not be as high as Furia's, but his potential alongside the entire cast's ultimates and general abilities likely outdoes anything in the entire game. Period. That's pretty much it. I wish this ultimate did no damage, that way I could start and end with ultimates that do 0 damage, but nah. Ceres's ultimate just has to do a grand total of 10 damage to everybody affected. Crazy. Absolutely nuts. Game changer. In all seriousness though, in my opinion, Ceres ult is the staple of power. There's a reason Makoa's hook was so damn hard to balance all those years ago. Giving the control of movement to the enemy is so incredibly powerful. It's not just a stun or a fear, it's a get over here that's really hard to avoid. Similar to Furia's, it has its place in pretty much any circumstance, but I would say based on my experience with it, that Ceres's is more consistent. And if an ultimate known for team wipes is consistent, literally what more could you want in an ultimate? Furia might give your team crazy amounts of possibilities, but Ceres brings those possibilities to you. I should be your campaign manager. Okay, I want to make a joke about this, but I can't, I forgot Corvus. I forgot Corvus.
Behold the power of the abyss!
So what do I think about Corvus? I don't know, it's like a way worse Ashe ult. Its main purpose is for area control, and I guess it does okay on that front. Like, its damage is bad for an ult, but at least you don't exactly want to be in the circle. It just does so little so slowly, like most folks can hop out super leisurely, as it doesn't cripple or nothing. Apparently the actual damage is all percentage based, like it starts with a quote-unquote burst, dealing 15% of the enemy's health as damage, followed by dealing 6.25 max health as damage over the course of 6 seconds. Not that I ever would have noticed. Whatever it was, I just knew it was low. It is pretty big though, and it can affect the enemy team en masse alongside map control. I don't know, it's just so underwhelming though. I don't think I've ever died as a result of this ultimate, like I just get out. It can be tough I guess for characters like Tyra or Inara with no movement, but I don't know, I play a lot of Inara and I've never had a problem. Oh yeah, and the startup is absurd. 60% DR and CC immunity, but still. It's huge and obvious startup that makes it even easier to avoid, and we're talking about an ultimate that's already super simple to get out of. If the enemy can't get out of the way though, it can do upwards of 90% of the enemy health over 6 seconds, when they could leave at any time. I don't know, I'm being harsh. It does inherently do its job of area denial, just a lot softer than a lot of others in this similar variety. It can be cancelled too if you just want to use its startups DR and CC immunity. I think I'll put it like here. It does its job better than Octavia, but is it better than a Term Revive? Probably not.
Step into the dark and die.
I guess I gotta do Omen too while I'm here. When I started ranking all the alts, Omen wasn't even out yet, so take this with enormous grains of salt. I've hardly played Omen, and I've never seen an Omen actually kill someone with his ult yet, so I'm just theory crafting at this point. So like, the damage is pretty stupid, but will he ever actually be able to hit it? Because this might just be the slowest ultimate in the entire game. Editing me, please fact check that. Kinda makes sense since the damage is so high. It does 666 damage, subtle by the way, every 0.15 seconds for 6 seconds, aka 4,440 damage every second. Holy shit. Making mincemeat out of pretty much anything and making tanks legit look like squishies. For fun, that makes his potential max damage 26,640 damage, the second highest damaging ability in the game. Asterix. To be honest though, that's all mostly fluff, as the ult's concept is simply meant to reflect the idea of if you somehow get this to hit, whomever you hit is most definitely dead. Placing the actual ult takes a whole 2 seconds, including a half second of CC immune windup and 1.5 seconds of startup. And it's not big either. Like, you're gonna hit skies more often just because it's huge. Omen's ult just seems too slow for its size, honestly. Like, there's a point where the potential of a slow ult that does tons of damage becomes less of a skill-based prediction sort of potential and more just pure guesswork and relying on the enemy to mess up somehow. Granted, Omen can toss people in with his Q. I'll have to see how consistent that is over time, considering the enemy knows that and will react to it. I don't know, but the ult just seems too slow in my opinion. Even corner tanks with no mobility can just walk away normally. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, for now it seems surprisingly underwhelming for how wacky of an ult it is. I'm not gonna quote-unquote officially rank Omen's ult, but if I was, to be safe, I'd probably place it just below Skies, meaning it'd be around 37th. In my opinion though, it's way too early for me to place the ult confidently, so that's just vaguely around where I'd place it, as this whole Omen section is merely just a few bonus thoughts. Okay. I'm done. That took so fucking long. Getting footage of every character using their ults was an absolute nightmare. I should have just used all bot matches, but no, I wanted to feel organic and grab. So, if this list ends up being absolute shit, or if every ult ends up changing in the near future, yeah, live with it. I'm never doing this again. I want to rank skins. I'm going back to ranking skins. Okay? Okay. Subscribe. What's my outro? I don't care. Bye. Give me the wheel of pain. I need to listen to more ballin' covers. Bunbo. Ever wish you were a fish? Just waiting to be snatched out of the water. Bumbo. I wonder how many 20s I've caught. A lot. I can aim my fishing? What the fuck? Hey everybody, it's me, Fox McCloud. I'm gonna hit you with 3 up airs and then a shine spike. Vote for me for president of Corneria. Oh no guys, oh no, oh no guys, I'm gonna fall. I like watching how the line goes through the slightly lighter portion of the water there. You know what? I give up.